So what do you think? What do you think that looks like in the next 3 to 5 years? Like a commercially legal psychedelic product?
There's 3 different pharmaceutical companies that have received authorization from the FDA to test psilocybin for treatment of depression. So if any of those companies succeed, then at some point in the future, maybe in the next 5 years, you'll be able to go to a specialized clinic and have a specialized therapist who's been trained for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy administer psilocybin to you legally as a treatment for depression. But that's still going to be a kind of specialized and expensive treatment that will only be available to people with health insurance.
Right.
So at the same time, there has to be work done to change drug policy so that everybody has access to these things, even if they.
So we're still talking about like a heavily regulated prescription psychedelic experience.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about on the recreational side? Is there?
Well, I mean, in Oregon, they're legal in a few different cities in the United States. They've decriminalized psychedelics. In most instances, that simply means that it's harder for them to arrest you for it. It doesn't really allow for any kind of legal sale of psychedelics. I mean, that's a step in the right direction, but it's not everything. Whereas in Oregon, there is now provisions where people can administer psilocin and psilocybin if they want to in certain frameworks.
Right.
So that's the direction that everything is moving.
So,
but also the government is still making psychedelics illegal as we speak. So it's happening in 2 different directions simultaneously.
The research you're doing, is it are these new chemicals you're creating through combinations of things, or like, explain what you're doing, because there is the purity of the actual plant that you ingest, and that feels so like direct and connected without like the middlemen of other agents coming, other substances coming in. But obviously with Vic's experience here, that's an extraction of the plant, right? Essentially, and put into some kind of candy. But you're doing something different.
Yeah, and these things don't need to come from plants. Like LSD, I think most people enjoy LSD, and that doesn't come from a plant.
Most people enjoy
Most people enjoy LSD.
Can I ask about, since you brought LSD up, is that a thing that's like dangerous to do, or is that safe? Because they always talk about or joke about like flashbacks and stuff like that. But is that a real thing, and is it safe?
Is LSD safe?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that it's categorically safe for everyone at any dose. I mean, especially if you're vulnerable to psychosis, it could potentially be dangerous. But I would say that it's essentially impossible to overdose on it. It's not associated with death, so you wouldn't want to drive a car while you're on it. You know, there's potential to hurt yourself or jump out a window or something like that. But even that's pretty rare.
For God's sake. Let me get back to my question.
Yes. I got questions.
Yeah, but you're doing something different than extracting the psilocybin from a plant, correct? Is it, in layman's terms, as best possible, explain kind of what you're doing in the lab?
Yeah, I mean, so people only know about a couple psychedelics, normally LSD and psilocybin and maybe mescaline or a couple of other things, but there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of psychedelics. So there's an enormous number of things that you can do to these structures to modify them, to make them longer lasting. Some of them last for several days.
Oh, Jesus.
Some of them only last for a minute or two, like DMT. And so you can play with different modifications of the molecule to augment certain properties to maybe make them better for treatment of depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or PTSD or whatever, or just make them better suited to therapeutic use, because something like LSD has such a long duration that if you have to have a therapist or 2 therapists sitting with each patient for 8 hours, it's very expensive. Therapy is already really expensive for a standard 50-minute session. Most people already don't have access to that.
Right.
So then when you scale that up to 8 hours, that makes it like a really intensive procedure from a psychological standpoint.
Sure. Okay, so what are you doing in the lab?
Making new drugs. Synthesis, organic synthesis.
From
one.
Right, okay. From what sources? Like is that
Do you pour
from indole. I mean, usually the starting material is an indole. So this chemical called indole. usually is or some.
That's what Phil Braun is right now, indole. That's an inside joke from the show.
Very good, Tim.
So what is that? Is that a plant or a organ? Is it a moth? What is it in the world?
It's not a moth. It's a naturally...
Are moths psychedelic? Because they're all over my fucking house right now.
One way to find out.
No, it's just a chemical. I mean, the problem with explaining this stuff is it's chemicals that have different reactivities, and you connect them like Lego pieces to create new little molecular sculptures that have different types of activity. Some of them might be shorter acting or more potent or more of this or less of that. And it's the same way you make a psychedelic the same way you'd make anything else, the way you'd make, any other type of drug.
I assume what you're working on is very structured and scientific, and there's a plan in place, and you're taking it very seriously. How do you test this? Do you just take it?
Well, there's a thing that mice do when they've been given a psychedelic called the head twitch response. If a mouse is given a psychedelic drug, it twitches its head in a very specific way, and that combined with supporting information about what receptors it binds to can provide a strong indication based on the behavior of a mouse that a certain drug is psychedelic.
What the hell? Okay, that explains it.
If a mouse twitches its head, do you say, okay, maybe I'll take a lick and get on your bike and ride home?
First step. That's the first step before something is considered as a medicine. I mean, historically, it would be the opposite. You'd look at the head twitch response and you might say that's a reason not to make this a medicine because that's indicative of it being a psychedelic. Traditionally, this is something that you'd want to strip out of any pharmaceutical. For example, there's an HIV medication called efavirenz that's psychedelic, but they spent a lot of time trying to remove that activity because they didn't want people who had HIV to have to take a psychedelic every day. Now it's sort of the opposite. People are using that model to assess whether or not a drug is psychedelic because it's now understood that that can have a therapeutic effect.